In February, I did my first TBR game, and in February, I failed my first TBR. Let's talk about it. My God, what is happening here? I just took a shower. That's my excuse. All right, let's talk. So if you've watched my TBR for February, if you haven't, you can watch it here. But if you've watched it, you know that this was the first month where I actually did something like a game where I tried to use a bunch of interesting ways to pick the books that I shall read in February. And I thought my choice was really good. I have the books written here in my TBR journal, and we're gonna go through them one by one. And the first book was Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb. This was my first TBR jar pick. The second TBR jar pick was The Black Company by Glenn Cook, and the third TBR jar pick was Caliban's War by James S. A. Corey. And then we had Hidden Riches by Nora Roberts for the Adventure in LDA Reading Challenge, created by G from Book Roast. I'll link her channel in the video description. The prompt for February was to read a book either with trees on the cover or with water on the cover, and I picked this one up. Next we had Catching Fire by Suzanne Collins. This was for the Buzzword Reading Challenge, created by Kayla from Books and Lala. I will link her channel in the video description as well. The prompt for the month of February was verbs, and I picked this one for the word catching on the book cover. Next we had Crooked Kingdom by Lee Bardugo for buddy read, and the last book was Titan's Curse by Rick Riordan, and that was for prompt cards, and the prompt was to read a book with your favorite trope. So now, how did I do? And the answer is, I did great in terms of reading, but I didn't do great in terms of following up with my TBR, which is no surprise considering that I never do well with predetermined list of things that I need to read. I am quite the mood reader. However, I managed to read 4 out of the 7 books that I had put on my TBR for February, and I managed to start one of the other 3 without finishing it. So let's see what I was able to read in the order in which I picked the books up. The first book I read in February was Catching Fire by Suzanne Collins. This is the second book in the Hunger Games trilogy, and I loved it. I had kind of forgotten how much I enjoyed dystopian, and this book reminded me of that love for this genre, and I had such an amazing time reading it. I think I read it within like a day or 2, and it's perfect. It's so great. Is this the best time to be doing this? All right, I have a cat here digging my couch, so if you're hearing weird noises, I'm hearing them too. You know how often the middle book in a trilogy feels like a chore you need to complete before you get to the real good part? Well, not in this case. The author has this great talent to create what I like to call cozy dread, where terrible things are happening to our main characters and you watch them from a safe and cozy distance, and you're looking forward to figuring out what's going to happen next. I also like the character work, which kind of surprised me because Candace's character is not the most likable, I don't think. Yet, she was very realistic in her expression and very consistent, which I very much appreciate and sadly don't find very often in a lot of books. And when you contrast her personality to that of Peeta, I think they make a great combination. In addition, the background characters of Haymitch and Effie and Finnick and the Beauty Squad were a great example of turning a stereotype into masterpiece, and I very much enjoyed reading about them, putting good people on the wrong side and seeking to understand the ones who could be considered your enemy are something that is sorely lacking in modern literature, and I very much appreciated it in this book. I also very much liked how twists were revealed in this book, with the main character seeking to understand them in her head before they were shown to us. We weren't just shown something, but she was reasoning it out in her head prior to it, and that is something I very much enjoyed. And the pacing was masterful, with so many things happening, yet sparing some time for quiet moments as well for us to be able to catch our breath. It was great. I gave it 5 stars. And honestly, after completing it, I was kind of debating whether I should pick Mockingjay right after that, the third book in that trilogy. I didn't. I stayed away from it, but it cost me a lot of self-control. Next, I picked Percy Jackson and the Titan's Curse, the third book. The third, maybe? I think it's the third book in the Percy Jackson series, and I had absolutely phenomenal time reading this. I gave it 4 stars because, well, there are some shortcomings, and being that this is a middle grade book, there are some things that were kind of surface level. There wasn't a lot of depth, but obviously this book wasn't written for me, so I have no right to complain. Yet my personal experience dictates that I should give it 4 stars because that's how much I enjoyed it. But I had a good time. I had a great time being in this world. I love this series. I think Rick Riordan is a genius when it comes to embodying Greek mythology and bringing it to the modern world. I think that was done perfectly, and if I was a kid reading this, I would have been even more excited, I'm sure. But still, I had a great time. I can't wait to continue with the series. Again, gave it 4 stars. Great time. Next, I picked Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb. This is an adult fantasy and the second book in the Farseer trilogy. I'm not going to talk about the plot and the synopsis of this whole thing. I already did multiple times, and I'm sure you can Google it if you're interested. Now, this was one of my unofficial 5-star predictions for this year, and I'm a little disappointed. As always, I enjoyed the world and I enjoyed the general direction the plot was going into. I love the depth with which Robin Hobb is writing her stories. I enjoyed that very, very much. And as a whole, I had a good time reading this, but I had some issues, and those were mainly 2 things. The first one was the subplot with Molly. I'm not going to explain what this subplot is because I don't want to spoil the book for you. As a general mood, it was way too overdrawn and dramatic, and I just don't like Molly. I think she is whiny and selfish and unreasonable, inconsiderate. It's how I feel about her, and maybe the circumstances that she is put into dictate to be that way, but I don't think there was enough put on page to justify her seeing things the way she did or demanding the things that she did demand. And as a whole, I don't like it when people complain that you don't tell them everything, and then as soon as you do, they attack you immediately using what you just told them. And then the second thing was the stupidity of the king and the king's people. And here I'm going to put a spoiler warning so you can jump to this timestamp if you don't want to be spoiled, because I really want to talk about this. Let's start with the king. The king's main role is to take care of his kingdom. He should put the kingdom's interest before self-comfort and family comfort. That should be job number 1. And I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that the majority of what the 6 duchies went through in this book specifically could have been avoided had somebody stopped Regal early on. And I am sure he knew how his son was, because even Fitz caught up with that early on whilst people were trying to convince him that that's not the case, which is a whole other thing that pissed me off. It was very, very clear what Regal was doing, and I don't find it a stretch for Fitz to suggest that something be done to stop Regal, because at the end he was correct, and all of the consequences that everybody suffered could have been avoided had people just listened to Fitz. And let's talk about the king's people, starting with Shade. I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name, but that's how I pronounce it. He kept on yapping the duty of king's people and how Fitz should be a king's man, and if he's a king's man, he should do what the king tells him, act in the interest of the king. But one of the most important duty of king's men is to protect the king and make sure to give sound advice whenever that is necessary. Instead of doing that, they just went with the flow and helped drug the king and pretended like things are gonna be okay somehow. It was really frustrating. And speaking of frustrating, I was kind of frustrated with Fool, with how his character was crafted in this book specifically, because I found inconsistency in Fool's motivation. In the beginning, he was saying that he has come here to pull the threads of destiny or something like that, you know, try to shape the future or whatever, and then implied that all Regal was doing was to avenge his mom. So you know that Regal is up to no good, yet you chose not to do anything about it and even prevent Fitz from doing something about it. And going back to his original motivation, to shape future or destiny or whatever. Yet at the end, when Fitz was trying to do something good, like eliminate Regal to save the 6 duchies, he was begging Fitz not to do it because all he wanted was for his king to die peacefully or something like that. So which is it? You either are lying or your character is inconsistent, and I don't know which is worse. I hope I expressed myself properly. I'm not sure that I did because I'm a little frustrated, as you can see, and this was very frustrating to read as a whole. I gave it 3.5 stars because, again, there was a lot of great stuff about this book, but I couldn't just ignore the glaring inconsistencies and stupid plot threads. I am still looking forward to reading the 3rd one and seeing how this story is going to conclude. And then the last book, so to speak, from my TBR that I picked was The Black Company by Glenn Cook. I started this around the end of the month and read it within 2 days. I had a good time. This was a nice book. This is an adult dark fantasy and is the first book in the Chronicles of the Black Company series. The story is told from the point of view of the doctor and analyst of the Black Company, which is a mercenary company working for, well, whoever pays. They start in one city, there's some ruckus, they get hired by somebody else to go to another place and do other stuff. And And I like this story very much. The synopsis that I just gave you, or whatever it was, doesn't do it justice at all. I advise you to go on the internet and read more about it if you're interested. And I very much enjoyed this original point of view of a mercenary company that works for the quote-unquote wrong side. That is something that you don't see often. It's usually, you know, the good guys battling the bad guys. In this case, it is, at least seemingly, the good guys working for the bad guys battling the good guys. This was a very nice book. Again, the storyline was very interesting. I am looking forward to continuing with the series, but I gave this book 3.5 stars because I found the narrative a little bit disjointed. The writing style of the author is such that a lot of the times you will be left with just a bunch of random hints as to what is happening. A lot of times things aren't explicitly stated, and while that could work in some cases, in this case I don't think the author did a good enough job for those to be enough to let you know even sometimes where you are. The time was passing in strange ways, people would be moving really quickly from place to place, and because the magic system was so soft, when you don't state explicitly what happens and there's no clear rules as to how things work, when you only throw hints, it becomes really confusing as to what actually is going on. Sometimes I would be seeing something on the page and it would take me 3 pages to understand that this was actually magic, and there was a lot of action that ended in a situation where I wasn't sure what the outcome was, and then I would go on the internet and read, and I would find out that I'm not the only one who is confused by this. So despite how much I enjoyed the story, again, I gave it 3.5 stars. I will continue with the series. I just hope that things get a little better later on. As for the other 3 books from my TBR for February, I already started Caliban's War by James S.A. Corey, read a few chapters, and I'm immensely enjoying it. However, when it comes to Crooked Kingdom, I didn't even start it, and it doesn't help that my friend also didn't have the time to start it, so I didn't feel any pressure to actually do that. I do want to read it though. I am excited about this one. I just didn't have the opportunity, and I will explain in a bit why. And then when it comes to the last one, Hidden Riches by Nora Roberts, the truth is that I started this one and I realized that it's actually a Christmas book, which doesn't become clear from the cover. You see there's nothing Christmassy about it, so that's what confused me, and I decided to just leave it for the holiday season because I don't like reading Christmas holiday books in any other period of the year. But that doesn't mean that I failed the Adventure in Eldia challenge for the month of February. I will show you in a second why. But I just wanted to say that for the books that I didn't finish or even start from my February TBR in the month of February, not counting Hidden Riches, I will transfer these to my TBR for March, which I will probably post tomorrow, so stay tuned. Now, the plot twist is that that's not all I read in the month of February. Matter of fact, I read twice as many more books than the ones I just mentioned. I decided to do an impromptu reading challenge to read 8 of the most popular romances out there on the internets right now. I will link the video over here if you'd like to watch it. I highly recommend you do so because I think it's very funny, and I had a lot of fun editing it, though I didn't have a lot of fun filming it or reading these books. You will see. But let's go through the books one by one. I'm not going to stop in great detail on any of them because you can see a detailed review of each and every single one of those in the video. I'm going to go through them in no particular order, and we're going to start with The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hoang. This is an adult romance about a lady with Asperger's who hires an escort to teach her the secrets of love so she can gain some sexual experience that way in a safe environment. And long story short, they fall in love. I had an okay time reading this. It wasn't the worst, it wasn't the best by any stretch of the imagination, but it was nice. The romance was sweet, there was a lot of spice. I gave the book 3 stars. Then we have The Duke and I by Julia Quinn. This was such a trip. This is a Regency romance about a girl who wants to get married, needs to get married, but apparently nobody wants to marry her, and then a duke who everybody's lusting after and everybody wants to marry him, but he doesn't want to get married. He's a friend of her brother, and they meet and they decide to fake date in order for her to gain more suitors and for him to be kind of shielded from the ladies that are going after him. Obviously, they fall in love and romance, and there's a lot of spice here as well. The book started great. The writing style of the author is amazing. The banter between the characters were great, but then something happened later on in the book, and I speak about it in detail in my video, so I'm not going to stop here on that, but this just completely shattered my enjoyment of this book, and I gave it 2 stars ultimately. Next, Ugly Love by Colleen Hoover. This was an okay book. I expected to dislike it way more than I actually did. It's about a woman who works in the medical sphere and a pilot guy who is a friend of her brother, and they meet in the building where her brother lives, and they start lusting after each other, but he refuses to be in love, blah 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 blah. He suffered a great trauma in his late teens. Ultimately they get together, he gets cured, and happily ever after. It was kind of lame, to be honest. There were some great stuff about this book, like the timeline in the past, although it was a little uncomfortable reading it because it's completely in the thoughts of the guy and they're kind of erratic, but it was very nicely done still. It kept my interest. It kept my interest in reading this book pretty much entirely, so I had a good time reading those. Other than that, it was kind of lame. There was spice in this book, I'm not gonna lie, and I gave it 2.5 stars. Then we have One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston. This is an LGBT romance between two ladies, one of which is stuck on a train in New York City. It's cute, it's sweet, there's a lot of nice characters. There's a lot happening in this book, yet I was kind of bored reading it throughout the majority of the time. The idea was great, the execution was kind of mediocre. I gave it 3 stars. And then we have Beach Read by Emily Henry. I think just by my face you can figure out what I thought about this book. I loved it. I didn't expect to love it. I thought it was gonna be just a, I don't know, shallow, standard contemporary romance. And while it was contemporary romance, it was way more than that. I loved it. I think the story was great. The setup was great. The characters were amazing. The resolution was great. I had a great time. Gave it 5 stars. I can't even believe that. I will continue with Emily Henry because this was fantastic. Oh, and I forgot to mention that Beach Read is the book that I actually chose to substitute Hidden Riches with for the Adventure and LDA Reading Challenge. So this is going to be the one that's going to fulfill the prompt of having water on the cover. And then we have Neon Gods by Katie Robert. This is kind of like urban fantasy-ish romance, though the fantasy elements were kind of implied but never really on screen, at least for what I read. It is about Hades and Persephone in this universe where the Greek gods live in some cities that are separated from the reality, maybe somehow. It's kind of like gangster romance where the gangsters are the Greek gods. This is very, very spicy. This is more so erotica than romance, at least in my opinion, and granted I'm not an expert in this sphere, but I was feeling very uncomfortable reading it and I wasn't having a great time because of that. I mean, you can watch in the vlog. So I decided to DNF it at 50% because I don't know that the book is bad, but I was just having a terrible time reading it. So I DNF'd it. Okay, I just realized that during this wrap up, I forgot one of the books because I read it as an ebook and it wasn't on the pile and it kind of escaped my mind. But the book is Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. This is the first book in the Brown Sisters series. I read it again as part of this romance reading experiment and I had a good time. I gave it 4 stars. It is very, very spicy. It's probably the second most spiciest book after Neon Gods, and I enjoyed it sufficiently. It wasn't perfect. There were some things that I didn't like in the beginning and at the end, but as a whole, it's one of the best romance books I have had the experience to read. And the last on the list of these books that I had for this reading challenge was Alone with You in the Ether by Olivia Blake. I hated this book. I gave it 2 stars. I hated it. I think it's very pretentious and it has a very fart-sniffing view on life and relationships, and I really, really, really hated it. I had a terrible time reading this. If it wasn't the first book I actually read on this reading challenge, I probably would have DNF'd it because I wouldn't have had any patience left. Again, gave it 2 stars. Don't recommend it. Kind of turned me off from the Atlas series that is also another very famous series by Olivia Blake, but we'll see when the time comes to read that one. Hated it. But that's not all. I actually read one more book that wasn't on any reading plans to begin with, but I kind of felt like picking it up and I somewhat enjoyed reading it, and that is A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. This is the first book in the series that carries the same name and is a retelling of The Beauty and the Beast, which I didn't realize until reading it this time. I have actually read it a few years ago and didn't remember pretty much any of it. So I decided to pick it up again, and I was thinking of substituting Neon Gods, which I DNF'd during my romance reading experiment. I was thinking of substituting it for this one, but then the video when I was editing it turned out too long, so I left it out, and I will post the reading vlog for this one separately. But I had a good time. I had a good time reading this. This is not a perfect book by any stretch of the imagination, but I had a good time. I think the fantasy that Sarah J. Maas writes is very, very interesting. What she does with her books which are mostly fantasy romances if you ask me, is she doesn't focus solely on the romance, which happens in a lot of fantasy romance books from my experience. She also weaves a lot of fantasy elements and a lot of world building into these books, and I think that's what makes them very interesting, alongside with her very easy to read writing style. I had a great time. You will see in the reading vlog when I post it, if you watch it, how many things I dislike about this book and how many things I find funny or ridiculous about this book. Yet at the end I left with a great feeling from reading it. I will continue with the series. I never continued with the series after reading it for the first time, but I will definitely do that now. So I gave this one 4 stars. So yeah, overall 12 books read, 1 DNF'd and 1 started but unfinished in the month of February, which I count as a great success overall, although I did fail my TBR, but you know, we take what we can get. I hope you enjoyed this video. I would be very curious to hear what you read in the month of February and whether you read any of these books. I would like to chat about them because I don't have anybody in my physical life who has read pretty much any of these books, and I would like to, you know, commiserate and rant about it, especially the romance books. I would like to hear some opinions because maybe I'm wrong on that. Anyway, let me know. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see my TBR for February, check out this video. Bye!